You're joining LaRouchePAC Saturday Night Class Series. This is Tony Papert. I'm with LaRouchePAC in Michigan, and we're beginning a two-part class by Barbara Boyd. Many of you know her or know of her. Barbara Boyd is LaRouchePAC's legal scholar. She has fought the attempted frame-ups of Donald Trump going back many years. She's famous, among other things, for a 2017 pamphlet called Robert Mueller is an Amoral Legal Assassin. She studied the origins of the theories and ideas of the neoconservatives with the Nazi lawyer Carl Schmitt. And tonight we have, on the occasion of the second fraudulent indictment of Donald Trump, we have a great opportunity to discuss these issues with Barbara. So, Barbara, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to spend a little. We can take questions about the indictments and the background to them and so forth in the question and answer period. But I thought it was pretty important at this point in our republic to once again go back and look at the difference between our Constitution and anything else which has ever served as a constitution or as a document founding a nation in any other society really in the history of humankind. And when you look at some of the stuff that's hurled against Trump, the word fascist is used by people on the left sort of indiscriminately and by the Democratic Party, with really no understanding of what fascism actually is or how that entire phenomenon actually came about in both Germany and in Italy in the interwar period. That is the period between World War I and World War II. And you know what I wanted to do tonight was to essentially talk about a gentleman who I met in theory almost 20, 30 years ago. And that is a gentleman by the name of Carl Schmitt, whose moniker in history is Crown Jurist of the Third Reich. I first ran into him. My experience with this goes back to my days at the University of California at Berkeley when I was a student. And like most people, my first encounters with fascism literally were in the types of government classes we had at that point in time, in which I thought, well, the way this came about in Germany had to be through a weakness in the German people and, some sort of major, forceful, racist type of operation, which actually led them to the Holocaust and all of the things which are known sort of in popular culture about how fascism actually came about in Germany. And in fact, if you go today and try and take a history class, you'll probably, hear the same stuff. Any charismatic leader, be it Franklin Roosevelt or Donald Trump, or for some people, even John F. Kennedy, anybody who was an actual strong leader of a nation following the defeat of fascism is kind of branded in that sense as a fascist, as an authoritarian. That kind of moniker has really nothing at all to do with what the actual history shows actually happened in either Italy or Germany during the interwar period. And my first kind of rude awakening to reality came when somebody came up to campus and said, they're showing this film by this woman, Leni Riefenstahl, which is about the rise of Hitler, and we should go see it. So I went to see it. And I came out of it completely shocked, because my image of Hitler at that point was every time he was saying stuff in the film in German, I imagined that he was saying things like, kill the evil Juden and this, that, and the other, which I had sort of been schooled in. In reality, what Hitler was talking about was environmentalism in the film. Greenyism, he was a greenie. And, at that point, environmentalism was just coming into being as a major movement in the United States. And I was in a state of really quite complete shock. I said, I got to find out about what really happened here. What is this about? What does it have to do with environmentalism and what's going on now? And then, when I was moved to New York and I was working at Columbia University, I ran into a young law student who I was having conversations with about a variety of things. And he handed me a paper and he said, this is my doctoral thesis, and it's about this guy, Carl Schmitt, who Americans don't know, but who actually engineered the legal rise of fascism in Germany. And I said, what do you mean the legal rise of fascism? What are you talking about? How could that possibly be legal? Wasn't it like a violent revolution or something like that? He said, no. It was all perfectly legal. It all came about through a legal theory. And this guy Schmidt's the guy who actually did it. So I dug in a bit and read his doctoral thesis, which I found to be fascinating. And over the years, I increasingly, sort of on the side, read a little bit here, a little bit there about Carl Schmitt. And then along came, the period of, let's say the late 90s and 2000. And I was doing some other research and I suddenly began to notice that Carl Schmitt's name was popping up everywhere on college campuses. He was in law reviews, he was in law classes, he was in radical journals like Telos, which is a journal really which is about as left and Marxist as you can go, and actually is run by a bunch of left-wing anarchists. More importantly, he was popping up in all sorts of conservative journals and other places. And I said to myself, what the heck is going on here? Why is everybody suddenly so fascinated with this guy named Carl Schmitt? So 9/11 really sort of made that clear to me. It suddenly dawned on me. That we are now in what Carl Schmitt was talking about. An emergency condition, a state of exception in which all relevant law vanishes and new laws and a new legal regime and a new legal order can be set up. During the interwar period, it was the period of the Weimar Republic, and it had a constitution. And in that constitution was one article called Article 48. And what it said was, we'll go along with regular parliamentary democracy and so forth and so on. That's what the Constitution said. But in an emergency, the president of Germany, whoever that may be, so basically there was a piece of the Weimar Constitution which allowed for rule when there were emergencies occurring under the Constitution. And this particular procedure, this particular constitutional provision, which we've kind of experienced in our own way under the conditions of COVID and so forth, allowed for the suspension of all civil and constitutional rights and for the president to essentially rule supreme, very similar to things which deal with war powers and other things under our constitutional system, a little broader. Now, what happens is that that's essentially the mechanism manipulated by which Hitler was actually put into power in Germany. A little bit of background on Schmidt. During World War I, he worked with the General Staff. He was an administrator of martial law. He was so fascinated with that after the war that he went to work, coming back, trying to find some means of authority to run a state under crisis conditions, crisis management. He studied Bolshevism, and he also studied Mussolini, who was then, of course, the leader of fascist Italy, coming into power in 1923, 1924. And he came to the conclusion that the ideal state, in his view, was Mussolini's fascism in Italy. That is, that Mussolini had managed to combine the state, the church, a free economy, and really a whole plethora of propaganda and powerful myths by which to motivate the population. The myths, like the ones which we're being bombarded with now in terms of various forms of identity politics, gender ideologies, the Democratic Party's religion, etc. And Schmidt decided that Bolshevism was the enemy of the state, the absolute worst enemy that could possibly happen, and dedicated his life thereafter to figuring out ways to defeat Bolshevism. And he had a certain character in terms of his legal philosophy. He basically, the fundamental aspect of what he wrote was that any state is founded on the ability to distinguish between friends and enemies. The leader, the legitimacy and leadership of any state is actually determined by a leader capable of actually distinguishing between friends and enemies and acting concretely in the right fashion under conditions of war. Now, he proceeds from that, and I'll go into it in a little more detail, to provide a legal theory or justification for each stage of Germany's descent into Hitler's very legal dictatorship. In other words, Schmidt was the guy. If you know Germans, basically you know that they are very prone to legalities, very much, respectful of legalities. And it would be very difficult to see how you could impose Hitler on that population without being able to sell at least a mythological view to the German population that all that was happening was perfectly justified and perfectly legal. So that's my introduction to tonight's class in terms of thinking about where we are now as a nation, contrasting it in some respects to where the Germans were, which is very provocative, at the point of 1932, 1933. I'm going to take a short detour at this point because we're talking about legalities and systems of justice. You'll note that I haven't yet talked at all about the American Constitution, the American Revolution, or its actual distinction from all of this. But let's take a slight detour to Plato's Republic, which is really where you get at the fundamental notion of thinking about, which I think we need to be thinking about at this point, what is justice? Exactly what is it? And if you've read the Republic, you know that in the first book of the Republic, a character by the name of Thrasymachus is in a conversation with Socrates and in a debate with him. And he basically makes three propositions. He says, justice is nothing but the advantage of the stronger. Justice is obedience to the laws. And justice is nothing but the advantage of another. In other words, Socrates, might makes right, similar to what we're seeing in our republic right now. What do you got to say about that? How can you possibly say that there is anything other than might makes right? That's the reality of this world. Then we get into book 2 of the Republic, and they have a long discussion of that in book 1, which I think is very much worth reading. But we get into book 2 of the Republic, and Socrates at this point is in a conversation with a character by the name of Glaucon. And what he says, Socrates says, well, Glaucon says, really, we've been looking at justice in terms of its results, justice in terms of how it functions, justice in terms of its utility. Really, what's the essence of justice aside from considering its benefits or the lack thereof? And that's the entire topic of book 2 of the Republic. Now, as Susan Kokinda has told us endlessly and what is true. Book 2, which is controversial, to say the least, a lot of people take it as a recipe, or that Plato actually was coming down with various statements which represent his view in totality of what justice is. And he had a very autocratic view, as this is viewed by the neoconservatives and others, as he talks about this, because they don't really understand the purpose of a Socratic dialogue. What actually happens in book 2 is that Socrates and Glaucon engage in the discussion of what is the essence of justice. They start out by saying, and this is my theme for tonight, the very worst perversion of justice is seeming to do justice while actually doing evil. That is the ability to cloak outright evil in the robes of justice. That's both Carl Schmitt, and in the wake of Donald Trump's indictment, I think it's what our United States Department of Justice is right now. So what happens in book 2 is they go on and basically Socrates says, look, this is hard to get at in the small. Why don't we try this? Why don't we try this method of hypothesis? Why don't we build out a city? Because that will allow us to actually discuss this justice question more broadly and see what the tensions are as we build out a city and then build out something else. What kind of mess are we going to create? And that's exactly what happens in the Republic. They come across all of the various paradoxes which have existed in history in various societies as they arise, and then as they make mistakes or come up against paradoxes in their viewpoints and can't solve them, and they decline. Now, this is the first place that I think it's really important to interject the difference between this tendency, still present in Plato and elsewhere, but evolving into European history, and what happened with our founders. As opposed to what you've been told and what we've constantly emphasized in this class, the Constitution of the United States did not come from the Enlightenment and John Locke. Each one of the founders, in studying the Federalist Papers, you'll see this, went all the way back in history in detail, because they were deeply aware that they were founding something entirely new. And they were driven to know, how come republics fail? Or how come they succeed? And the only way we can study that and come up with something which is going to work here is by actually knowing in the very depth the entire history of republics as they have existed throughout the history of the world. That's how come we can actually figure out something which can actually represent a constantly more perfect union. Now, if you think about it, that idea which the founders had involves specifically two very different ideas about what human beings are. In our country, our idea, or the founders' idea of human beings, clearly set forth in our founding documents, is that men and women are endowed by God with creativity, the ability to discern paradoxes as we get more and more knowledge about the world and about society. One of them is the paradox which we constantly come across in life between freedom, which is absolutely critical to the ability to think freely and to create, and necessity, the things which we must do, have to do, can't be free about if we're going to survive. We've got to eat, we've got to grow things, we've got to actually grow our economy in a certain way, so that our freedom is cabined by certain necessities to keep us alive and to drive our future progress. And our idea is, and the idea of our founders, is that we come across these paradoxes and we resolve them to get to higher and higher levels of productivity and creativity, and to constantly be more perfect as we evolve. You see the tensions between government and private society constantly changing, constantly evolving in terms of a situation. Neither the private sector nor the public function very well at all if you kill God and remove religion from organized society, and your culture collapses into anarchy and into pure narcissism like we're seeing now. Our founders were constantly asking the question, what kind of government actually nourishes that individual creative gift from God and allows it to advance, creating both our material sustenance and our cultural foundations? That's completely different than the tradition of Locke, Hobbes, Hume, Hegel, and the Enlightenment. But all of these people, Locke, Hobbes, Hume, Hegel, are found in Carl Schmitt, the Crown Jurist of the Third Reich and the legal author of fascism. Schmitt and the fascists actually believe that universal truth is not knowable by human means, that men and women are evil. In fact, Schmitt says this at the outset. He says, if men and women are not evil, then my ideas would indeed be evil. Now, with that kind of short and provocative interlude, I just want to go back and sketch for you how this all happened in terms of Hitler's ascension and Schmidt's role in it, beginning in the 1928, 1929, 1930 period in Germany, along with the same period of time in Italy, the interwar period. Now, the entire world at that point, this is the period of 1929, 1930, 1931 to 33. This is the point of the world depression here in the United States and really worldwide. It's also the aftermath of the First World War, in which Germany was defeated, in which the United States and Britain imposed incredible constraints and basically wanted to loot the entire German economy, was not going to allow the German state ever to rise again through the Versailles Treaty and the Dawes Plan. Essentially, the country, like Russia right after 1989, was in a state of overt civilizational collapse. So what happened is that in Germany itself, you had a complete collapse of society. And the only way that they figured they could survive was by brutal austerity against the population. You had two regimes in the post-war period, the Brüning regime and the von Papen regime, which essentially just dropped wages, made people work like slaves, drop all social safety nets. The country was in complete economic devastation. Add to that the fact that this nation had just come through probably at that point, the worst experienced war in human history, the First World War, which was trench warfare, just brutal, carnal killing house. And you have the recipe for a completely demoralized and pessimistic population. Somewhat similar to the anarchy which we're experiencing now in our largest cities, if you actually think about it. So, the British played a huge role in this because, beginning in the 1920s and 1930s, they were working on a plan to set up Germany and had envisioned that, Germany would be the state which could actually march against Russia and destroy the beginning Soviet Union, after the Russian Revolution. They viewed Germany like Ukraine today as kind of a marcher lord state, which they could control and use as a force to essentially devour Russia. And that was the British strategy, and that was the British plan. Right up until the, imposition of Hitler in this entire mess. Now Schmidt's role in this was that he went to work for both von Papen and for Brüning to use the emergency powers in the German Constitution to actually make legal the very brutal suspensions of law, suspension of working rights, suspension of trade unions, all the things that actually happened at that point, to make all of those things legal based on the emergency conditions which Germany actually encountered at that point. At the same time, Hadjimer Schacht was working with the Bank of England to take ultimate control of the German banking system and to set up, basically a British enclave in the Reichsbank of Germany. At the very last moment, the American kind of idea came to these people. It was kind of like a last-ditch possibility of avoiding this descent and the ability of the Nazi Party to rise to power. And that occurred in the form of the Friedrich List Society. For those of you who know your history about the American system, you know that Friedrich List was a complete advocate of the American system. And the List Society in Germany actually had some very, very critical components, among whom was Kurt von Schleicher, the last German chancellor before Hindenburg, who ultimately was so old and feeble that he ended up appointing Hitler. And von Schleicher, at the very last moment, tried to get and the List Society tried to found a national bank, similar to the National Bank of the United States, to actually issue credits for industrial development, for scientific development, for the types of development policies which could actually pull the nation away from the cliff. They were defeated. The Nazi Party, at the point where this proposal was being made in the fall of 1931, 32, basically the Nazi Party itself was bankrupt. They received a massive infusion from the Harriman family here in the United States, the Harriman banks, the Morgan banks, George H.W. Bush's father, Prescott Bush, played a key role in this. All of them decided that they were going to line up behind Hitler, and Hitler was indeed appointed the Chancellor of Germany in 1932, although he had not actually consolidated power, and he had not actually consolidated a dictatorship. That occurred when the Nazis staged a false flag operation and burned down the German Reichstag, the parliament for the German nation, and created, therefore, a huge constitutional crisis. Essentially, it was said that it was the Russians, the Bolsheviks, who burned down the Reichstag, and that in order to confront this emergency, the powers not only of Article 48 had to be invoked, but Hitler had to be given actual emergency powers such that he could be what Schmitt called a commissarial dictator. In other words, a temporary dictator in the same mode as Napoleon was a dictator in the late Republic of France. So essentially what happens is that Schmitt justifies all of this by saying, as I've said, in all of these things that I've been using to attack the normative experience of the former republic, the only way you can govern under conditions of emergency is through a dictator who has the legitimacy of the state behind him and can actually decide things based on the concrete situation rather than any moral purpose or anything else. And the correct decision in the concrete situation, i.e. this emergency, determines whether or not the leader is legitimate and whether the state is legitimate. The person who decides in the state of exception in order to preserve order and protect the Constitution is worthy of being a dictator. That was Smith's rationale. And so then, what happens? He says, look, democracies based on norms, legal rules, and the separations of power are powerless when you're confronted by a charismatic and powerful religious or political threat to the existence of the republic, such as the Bolsheviks. The existence of exceptional situations, states of emergency, refute the very foundation of liberal political systems, which are premised on pre-established laws and norms purportedly applicable to all possible situations. He basically said that this idea results in simply endless legislative debates and discussions which cannot generate truth. And, a social democrat, if asked Christ or Barabbas, would immediately seek a consultation and set up a committee. So essentially what he's saying is that none of this stuff which actually existed prior to the state of emergency, prior to Hitler's advent to power, is capable of actually confronting the emergency the society faces. And he develops an entire theoretical matrix around how to govern or how to govern a people in a state of emergency. Needless to say, the Constitution of the United States is not a model for this guy. The model of this guy, as is the model of all fascist governments, including Mussolini, is the late Roman, republic, the late Roman Empire, and successive empires built on that model. In fact, the British Empire actually called itself the new Roman Empire and built up all of its ideas and policies behind this. So, in essence, at each stage of Hitler's ascension, you've got a legal theory or a synthetic legal theory actually justifying it. Shortly after that happened, Hitler slaughtered all of his political opponents in the Night of the Long Knives, including Kurt von Schleicher, who Schmidt had actually once worked for and declared to be a friend. But Schmidt, by 1934, was saying, the Fuhrer protects the law against the worst abuse when he, in the hour of danger, by virtue of his leadership, produces immediate justice. The true leader is, at the same time, always a judge. And basically what he said was that all of Europe, ever since World War I, has suppressed the constitutional distinction between legislative and executive powers because we need to keep legislative powers in harmony with the constant changes in the political, economic, and financial situation. We need to combine all of them in one authority, in one authoritarian rule, so that we're dispensing with the so-called separation of powers, and we're instituting a regime of genuine governmental legislation. It's wrong, Schmidt said, to call this a dictatorship. Rather, it represents the triumph of the older constitutional legality, i.e., that found in the thinking of Aristotle and in the format of the late Roman Empire. Now, during his service to the Nazis, Schmidt reported to Hermann Goering and Hans Frank. He supervised the German universities of the purging of any Jews from the universities. He was a raving anti-Semite, despite his complete sort of washing away of that by the left and by his right supporters here in the United States. Most certainly the key one is Leo Strauss. Some of you may know some of the people at Hillsdale College who follow Strauss, but it was Carl Schmitt who arranged Strauss's immigration to the United States under a Rockefeller Foundation scholarship. And it was Strauss in turn who edited for the United States the first version of Schmidt's work concerning the ultimate authority of the state being found in the distinction between friends and enemies. So I wanted to basically, and Schmidt was arrested at Nuremberg, but his British sponsors actually let him go. He retired peacefully, where he had various audiences with people from all over the world. He refused denazification because he said that he had no part in the genocide. He only provided ideas, or as he called it, a diagnosis. So that's the first part of my class for tonight. I hope it was provocative in terms of some of these ideas. I'm not saying there's a one-to-one correspondence between Carl Schmitt and where we are now in the United States, but there are definitely, when you look at the neoconservative movement in the United States, when you look at the neoliberal movement in the United States and its virtual merger at this point in the Uniparty in Washington, D.C., and you look at the popularity of Carl Schmitt throughout legal scholarship in the United States and throughout the world, it should shake you in your boots a bit. And you got to say to yourself, well, what is this really all about? And what it's about is creating synthetic legal theories to justify otherwise illegal and concretely evil actions by the state. It's what you find in the indictment of Donald Trump. It's what you find when you go back to what I said about the conversation between Glaucon and Socrates, that the worst perversion of justice is seeming to do justice while doing evil, or the ability to cloak outright evil in the robes of justice. So that's it for my opening for tonight. I hope it was provocative. And next week, we're going to talk about the difference between Lycurgus, who was epitomized by Friedrich Schiller as the leader of the Spartan state in ancient Greece, a state of legal theory which has much resemblance both to the Cultural Revolution in China, if you think about modern incarnations of it, and much of the sort of use of the United States as a rampaging British hegemon in trying to impose imperial edicts upon the rest of the world. And from the flip side of that, Solon, and the lawgiver for Athens, who actually put into motion what we're talking about here in terms of an idea of justice. And I will point out that Solon was actually readily referred to, as were all of the Greeks, as I started out, by our founders, actually thinking about, as they founded the Constitution, what worked and what didn't throughout all of history, and how do we set up something which meets the actual necessities of our definition of the capabilities of men and women. In other words, that truth is knowable, and that we are divine beings, and that we exist to go forth, multiply, and subdue the earth. We don't exist to actually engage in forever war against the rest of the human race. So that's how I'll end my sort of class for tonight and open it up for questions.